and of the Google stuff I will use as a background. So here I've got a PowerPoint for my introductory lecture, and I do anticipate this would be the most I would be talking, and I think this is true of any class I teach. The first day or the first week I'm talking at you, but that's not going to be indicative of how the class will go. Of course, just because I talk doesn't mean people have to listen, pay attention, etc. So, most of y'all, when I talked to you in advising, you stated that you did not have any background in women's Caribbean literature, and I don't expect that you would have. But you have had background in literary theory, and y'all talked a lot, I think, about feminism and feminist theories and women's writing and so forth in Dr. Stewart's class. So I think this is going to be, again, I've said this before, a nice transition into what we're doing here. So I have prepared some introductory stuff for you. Part of it is about the literature and the theoretical background, and part of it is just about the history of the Caribbean and the cultural context, which you really need some kind of outline to hold on to, or you're really going to you might feel a little bit lost. So I will start here at the beginning of my slideshow, and please don't laugh at my very sad PowerPoints, but doing the best I can here. So, women's Caribbean literature. Here we are. Welcome. Hopefully I'm not going too quickly. I do have a tendency to go very, very quickly. So, the two questions I want this whole class to focus on. One, how has this literature been defined, understood, theorized for the past 25 years? I came to it in 2000. I came to it in 2000. So I've been here for the last 15 years. Wasn't here for the first 10 years. Had to catch up on that. So over the past 25 years, yeah, how has this literature been defined, understood, theorized? What has influenced it? What kind of sense are people trying to make of it? And then the second question is, well, how are you going to define it? How are you going to understand it? How are you going to theorize it? And again, that's what you will write about in your journals and in your final exam project, is you will be looking at these theories. I'm going to have you read different theoretical stuff each week and applying it to the literature, and then perhaps looking for, I don't know, where you agree, where you disagree, new things that you're seeing. Do these theories work on every single thing that we read? They may not. You know, these are only human beings, and that's not some sort of infallible text. So again, I'm hoping that we will be very focused just on these two tasks. I think we got to keep it simple and keep our eyes on the prize, as they say. So looking at what has influenced women's Caribbean literature, obviously the first thing is going to be feminism. The influence of the rise of feminist studies and feminist ways of looking at literature. This really started, I think, in the late 60s. And so by the time Caribbean studies came around to be established, feminism was very well established. And where Caribbean is coming out of it is still taking this approach towards, well, wait a second, here we've had these women in the Caribbean, these women writers, and just like Gilbert and Gubar talk about the woman in the attic, which is a reference to the first wife in Jane Eyre, who our first book is about. She's from the Caribbean. Just like we've looked at British literature and U.S. literature, and we see all these women who have been silenced. They've written stuff, but it hasn't been part of the studies of these literatures. These women have also been marginalized politically, economically, etc. Similar things are going on all over the world. Yay, the marginalization of women is a global phenomenon. So the Caribbean studies is saying, okay, well, how can we borrow this stuff from feminism, but also make sure to make it particular to the Caribbean? So with the Caribbean, we have differences coming up in terms of the location, the language, the culture, race, all of these sorts of things, but we're still going to see the influence of a feminist sort of point of view. We also are going to see the influence of African American studies, which came along shortly after feminist studies really got established in the United States in the 1970s. But it's also that way of looking at literature not by gender, but by culture. One marginalized group's experience of the United States, the literature that comes out of it, the culture that comes out of it, etc. So that approach is also going to be highly influential. When you read the introduction to Out of the Kumbla, you're going to see, I think, both these authors talking about how they were influenced by going to school when African American literature was, you know, a big new thing, and how this formed them as scholars, and then also looking at African studies and how that also influenced them as well. So those things are also coming up. And there are a lot of similarities because people of African descent got to this hemisphere all in the same way through the Atlantic slave trade. So there is that shared history of people being kidnapped and sold and transported across the Atlantic and forced to work in brutal work conditions, etc. So, and then, what do? We free people, and then how do we deal with it as a society? So that is a common thread. Another common thread is post-colonial studies, and this is something that's a bit different from African American studies or from U.S. literature, because the United States became post-colonial a very long time ago. And it was also a settler colony, meaning that the people from the colonizing place were the ones who were still in charge and running things after independence. It's a much different power dynamic. In the Caribbean, it is majority people of African descent. It is not, the population has never been majority European descent. And so that power dynamic is much different. In order for a Caribbean nation to become post-colonial, whether it's through just sort of negotiation and peaceful means or through, I don't think any of them have happened through violent means, through war, insurrection, then that European influence has to diminish and go away. So the Caribbean was colonized, just like all the rest of North, South, and Central America, and by different European powers. And we're going to mainly look, I think, Spanish, French, and English. We're going to look at Caribbean nations that were colonized by these three nations. And so this colonization, however, lasted quite a long time. In the case of Jamaica, we're going to read two books set primarily in Jamaica. It lasts until 1960. So their experiences of colonialism are still very fresh and still very new, and that influence is still very much felt. And also, too, these islands were economically underdeveloped on purpose, and it's just a much different situation than in the United States. So anything you might have picked up from literary theory regarding post-colonial studies, that is also going to come to bear here, because there is still a lot of tension between the islands that were colonized, they've gotten their independence or not in some cases, and then what is this lingering influence of the colonizer. And then lastly, we're going to be looking at postmodernism and how it influences the narrative style and structure of these books that we're reading. Post-colonialism and post-colonial artists, they often borrow heavily from postmodernism, because postmodernism offers a lot of models for kind of rebellion and subversion of tradition. And I'll talk more about this in just a moment. So this is why I love Caribbean studies. This is why I love post-colonialism. You just get a little bit of everything thrown in. And a reminder, 1990, this is when Out of the Kumbla is published. So leaving off from postmodernism, and I might actually, let's see if we can go back. Previous. You might take a look at this list and just sort of pause the video and make sure you've jotted all this down, and you can go ahead and just jot down anything you might associate with these things, especially anything from feminism or postmodernism that you might remember from Dr. Stewart's class, and anything from literary theory. All right, so let's go on and talk about postmodernism and narrative style and structure. So the big question that a lot of post-colonial and I don't know, marginalized cultures ask is, can we use what has been the dominant, realistic, traditional narrative structure and style to express a non-dominant or a marginalized or a radical form of subjectivity? And sometimes there are some post-colonial scholars who say you can't write a traditional, realistic, linear novel that's also post-colonial. It's just not possible, because they see this as you're kind of selling out, as it were. That's a question that's up for debate. I don't necessarily agree with it myself, but we're going to be looking at a lot of all the books that we're going to be looking at are not going to be traditional realistic narratives, and we're going to start with the worst, which is Wide Sargasso Sea, which is just a wild roller coaster ride, and we're going to end up in more familiar territory towards the end of the semester. So, second question, of course, is in what ways are we going to struggle as Western middle class readers? We are from the dominant group. We like these traditional realistic narratives. We like things that go in linear order and that have a plot and that make sense and that have, if not a happy ending, at least a resolved ending where we come to something, where we get some kind of message or lesson or hope or something like this. All these books are going to be working to frustrate us and to, I think, do what is called decenter us and to make us uncomfortable. And they are doing this on purpose. They're doing this, again, because they are rebelling against this. Do I have anything after this? No, I don't. They are doing this because they rebel against this traditional realistic narrative that has been handed down to them through their colonial education. They have gone and had a traditional British or French education, and they've read all these sort of classics that in no way am I denigrating. They are great books, but they've read them, and then they get to this point where they're like, well, wait a second. This is not our culture. This is something that was, quote-unquote, given to us by the colonizer. This doesn't really express our reality. These are wonderful books, but this is not us. This is not our identity. So how can we rebel against this? And so what happens, as I think I have said, is that oftentimes the linear is not narrative. It's not, linear. It is not told in narrative chronological order. Oftentimes there is not a clear ending or a satisfactory ending. I never teach a book with a happy ending. I don't think I ever have. And I think it's because I teach mainly post-colonial literature or colonial literature, and just ends either in confusion, despair, death, madness, etc. So we're not going to have a happy ending, just to let you know. And we might not even have a clear ending. Sometimes there's no plot. Sometimes the narrator is unreliable. We're dealing with people whose identity is in flux. They're struggling with even understanding who they are, and so they can't have this assured narrative voice that comes to some kind of big insight. Another thing that might be a struggle as well are the languages that are being used in the narrative. Again, these are writers who received a traditional British, French, colonial education, and so they learned, I don't know, standard English, standard French, etc. But this is one language. This is the language of power. This is the colonial language, but there are also other languages that these writers are using in their daily lives. And what happened in the Caribbean to a far greater extent than happened in the United States, it was the formation of Creole dialects. And of course we have dialects in the United States, but these Creole dialects sometimes are just so unlike the colonizer's language that, you or me, we couldn't understand them. And a Creole dialect happens in the Caribbean because you have this contact zone of just all these different languages. You've had different African languages brought in through slavery, and then these European languages, and what you get is you get the grammar and syntax and the vocabulary of all these languages kind of merging and forming something new, which linguistically is just really kind of cool and neat that languages do this, because they are living things. They're not these static pieces in a museum. But what has happened is that the schools, the official places like the government, they have suppressed these languages. They don't recognize them as being legitimate. They're seen as lesser, broken, dirty, whatever you want to label them. And so the big struggle for these writers is, well, if I use this colonial language, am I selling out? This isn't my identity, blah, blah, blah. So part of what you'll see in this rebellion is that they might throw in these Creole languages and they don't translate them for you, and that's just life. Because, again, we are being decentered. We might not see ourselves or our point of view or our world in these books, and that's just kind of the point. We are being put in a state of uncertainty, ambivalence, just being uncomfortable, because we're trying to, the authors are trying to get us to see that this is what it's like to be colonized. This is what it is like to, be pushed into trying to assimilate into this colonizer's identity, and it's not really true. And we have all these other identities, as I pointed out, these Creole identities and so forth. And, you know, what is it that we're supposed to pick? What is it that we're supposed to be loyal to? And so it's not this kind of, I don't know, set in stone kind of identity that we have. So right now I'm going to ask you to sort of pause again and take a look at these questions and maybe jot down any ideas or questions that you have about what I have just talked about. All right, and hang on to these questions because we're going to have a discussion forum so that you can ask them. So the next thing I want to get into that, and we've already started talking about it because I've already started talking about slavery and all that fun stuff, because the cultural and historical context is underlying probably everything. So we've got the influence of these postmodern forms of narrative, and then I'm going to talk about the cultural and historical context for our novels. So obviously I've already mentioned it, the legacy of slavery. These islands, they are small compared to the United States, and many of them, the slavery and the plantation economy, that was it. That is what dominated the island. And while slavery was still legal in the 17th, 18th, early 19th centuries, European powers made a ton of money off of these islands. It's just mind-blowing. The main crop is sugar, and cotton is also something that is incredibly profitable. I've just been reading this whole book about cotton, the history of cotton, the global history of cotton, and it's just fascinating. But France, for example, just made millions and millions and millions of dollars off of Haiti. It's just mind-blowing how much money was sucked out of these islands. But the hard part of this is that, of course, when slavery is made illegal, slaves leave the plantations because why would you stay? It's a horrible, terrible place where people are tortured and exploited and killed and so forth. And so these economies sort of fall apart, and some places, Britain in particular, they try to bring in indentured servants from India, the subcontinent, and that kind of works out, but not really. But basically these economies fall apart, but because the economy is not diversified, the islands are kind of left in a state of underdevelopment, and that's what they're still struggling with today. So slavery has that economic effect, and having this single economy culture, economic culture, but also with this legacy of slavery, it ties into a lot of stuff with race and racial identity. And let's see. Yeah, okay, so, sorry, looking at my notes here. As I've been talking about, the Caribbean shares this common ground with the U.S. with the experience of plantations and African slavery. And with racial identity in the United States, until pretty recently, it's really been within, I think, the past maybe 10 to 15 years, where our society has become aware of and comfortable with talking about people who are multiracial, people with kinds of more than one, they identify with more than one race, and you're actually given that box to check in. So let's say you have an African American parent and a white parent, then you have, you know, you're not one or the other, you're kind of a mixture of both. So where do you check this box? So, but traditionally, until very recently in the United States, you were one race or another. You were white or you were black. There was no in between. You were Latino, you were white. You were Native American, you were white. There just wasn't this fluidity that you see today in U.S. society, and it was kind of called the one drop rule. And this rule stated that if you had anyone in your family of African ancestry, then you were black. Of course, you know, it doesn't really work like that, but those were the official rules. And racial identity today is just much more nuanced. But from the beginning of Caribbean history, though, they never had this conception of white and black. Race has always been labeled along a continuum, and it's very complex. You can look at charts, and they'll show like 20 different racial identities, and it all has to do with who your parents were, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, how many of them are white, how many of them are of African descent, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of it also has to do with the way you look, if you are lighter skinned, darker skinned, if your hair is curly, if it's straight, if you have a nose that seems to be smaller, and it's all very complex. And so racial identity has never been a case of, oh, you're black or you're white. It's always been a case of, well, where do you sit on this scale, and where are you in the racial hierarchy? Because the lighter skinned you are, the closer you are to the top. And this translates not this translates into all kinds of power. If you can seem to be lighter through either your physical appearance or by sounding European or whatever, that you're higher on the racial hierarchy and you're higher on the socioeconomic hierarchy. And so, part of this you have no control over because your parents are your parents. But part of this too is that you can sort of whiten yourself by assimilating into a European culture. So you can choose to kind of leave behind your Caribbean or your Creole culture and try to become English, French, or Spanish. And I'll come to this at the end of the lecture too, but this is what, hold on. All right, sorry about that. I had a phone call. I'm having work done at my house all week. So this idea here, and I've already got the next slide up, that you can assimilate into a different identity. And Frantz Fanon wrote a very famous book in the 1950s called Black Skin, White Masks, and you can see from the title what he's talking about, that you might appear, your physical appearance might be quote-unquote black or of African descent, not white, not Caucasian, but you can, through assimilating your language, your education, the way you conduct yourself, etc., you might put on this white mask. And for him, this was very problematic. The first thing that happened is that he was this person who wore the white mask. He grew up in Martinique, which is still part of France. It was a French colony at the time, but it's an island in the Caribbean that's part of France. And he grew up there, really identified with France, went and fought for the Free French in World War II, was kind of, war veteran there, and then went off to medical school in France and was in Paris and other major cities. And in his mind, he was French. He was French just like the Caucasian French people. And he just got slammed with tons and tons of racism. And he realized that no matter how he spoke or how much education he had or how much money he had or how he conducted himself or whatever, he would always be seen as black or as not French. And so for him, it was kind of this psychological wake-up call that this white mask was deceptive. It was self-deceptive, and it was damaging to his psyche because, it was just not very much fun what he went through. And so he was approaching it really from a psychological point of view. He was going off to be a psychiatrist. And this book, that Black Skin, White Masks, that he wrote was just incredibly influential. And people are still talking about, the various ways that you can put on these masks of identity, so of racial identity, cultural identity, etc. And what just happened with the woman who was running the NAACP in Washington State, I think that's an excellent example of how we still are struggling with these things in the Americas. And we'll get to that when we talk about White Sargasso Sea, because I'm totally fascinated by this. So a more contemporary scholar, a post-colonial scholar named Homi Bhabha, you might have come across him in Lit Crit. I'll put his name up here. He has a really good way of describing this masking tendency that colonized people have. And what happens when you are confronted with the fact that no matter how you act or speak, you are never going to be white. White people will never accept you as white or as your equal or whatever. So he calls it almost, but not quite. Almost, but not quite. I think the whole phrase is almost the same, but not quite. Almost, but not quite. And Homi Bhabha, you might tell from his name, he is from India, and he is still alive. I think he's in his 60s. He teaches at Harvard. But he's approaching it from that point of view of being colonized in India by the British, etc. And he's saying, you're colonized by these people. They tell you, adopt our language, adopt our culture, adopt our attitudes, and you'll be one of us. And he's saying, yes, but you will always be brown-skinned, and you will always be looked down upon because of your physical appearance. So he says it's almost but not quite. And that kind of feeling, that's what Fanon's talking about. This is a place of a lot of frustration and anger well, you did your best, but it's still not good enough. There's nothing you can really do. It still all comes down to plain old-fashioned racism, and there's no getting around it. We might make each other feel comfortable if we culturally assimilate, but at the end of the day, we're still going to be racist against people who are not Caucasian. So that's the phenomenon that both of these authors are getting at. Homi Bhabha also uses this idea of masking in another way, and if you think about it, wearing a mask or a disguise can also be something that's very subversive and that you can use to achieve your own purposes, to deceive somebody, to make them uncomfortable, to get the better of them. So Bhabha looks at it as kind of a dual thing, or as a paradox, that the mask, yes, you can use it to fool yourself. The colonizer can use it to try to pretend like they're not racist, but the colonized can also use it to achieve their own ends, to trick the colonizer. So we'll want to look out in our reading for ways in which characters are masking, ways in which characters are assimilating, and how that works out for them. I suppose it's not going to be a surprise. It typically does not work out well, as you can see from these two scholars. So again, I'd like to take another moment to pause, because this is a lot of junk I'm dumping on you. Well, I guess it's not junk. That's not fair. It's a lot of context and background that I'm dumping on you. And of course, I'm coming to it from the perspective of, oh, I've been studying this since 2000. This is like my life, and it's part of my, just what I think about every single day. This is the first time y'all are coming to all of this. So I'd like for you to just kind of pause, take a look at these talking points, and again, write down questions that you have, because I'm going to ask you to ask your questions so that we can talk about them further. All right. So last point we talked about stuff to look out for the narrative style and structure, and how it's going to be experimental, non-traditional, postmodern. Talked a lot about, dumped a lot of stuff on you about race, assimilation, culture, colonization, etc. And now I'm going to talk about gender, because this is a women's Caribbean class. And you'll find this in Caribbean, people who study Caribbean literature, you typically study female writers or male. And when I first started teaching Caribbean literature here at Gardner-Webb to undergraduates, I just taught all women. And then after a couple classes, the students started saying, well, we'd like to read some male writers. I mean, you call this class Caribbean literature. Why don't we have any male writers? Well, fair enough. I don't call it women's Caribbean literature, but at the graduate level, I'm calling it women's Caribbean literature, and we're just looking at one gender. So it's not uncommon that this question comes up, women's writing versus men's writing. And again, I think y'all are talking about this in Dr. Stewart's class. And so a similar kind of dynamic is going on. Again, women in many cultures are marginalized, oppressed, etc. But for the Caribbean, I think what we need to keep in mind is that, again, a lot of this is going back to slavery and plantations. So again, it just really dominates everything. There's kind of this hangover from the experience, and for a long time there was a lot of shame and a lot of trying to avoid any associations with slavery, with African identity or history, because of this idea that, I don't know, the shame of being victims, or etc. But an important thing to talk about, it's a difficult thing to talk about, is the ways in which female and male slaves were treated very differently on plantations. And here we get to all of the stuff with rape and with sexual exploitation. And some books have come up showing male owners and overseers raping male slaves, and I fully believe that this was something that happened. I don't see why it wouldn't have. But it happened much more often to women, and so I guess this is why it comes up much more with female narratives. And so what happens is that this is a way in which men and women are having a very different experience of slavery. And it's it's not the women's fault, it's not the men's fault, it's just this is the way that it happened. And what further divides the men from the women, and this would be the case even men who are sexually abused and raped, is that the women are the ones who have babies. And this is where we get all of the racial diversity. It comes back to this. So, even though it's not something that they had any control over, because the choice was you either have this happen to you or you die, because you were not seen really as human anymore. And people, when you give people ultimate power, terrible, terrible things happen. And so this slavery is one of these just sort of shameful instances in which people have ultimate power over other human beings, and they just choose to use it very badly. So this is the big difference. And so you can also imagine too the community of slaves. Obviously, people still have relationships. They still have spouses. They still have mothers and daughters and fathers and daughters and sisters and brothers and all that fun stuff. So you can imagine what happens if you are a male and you cannot control these things happening to the women in your family, and you cannot protect them. And this goes back to kind of these ideas of the male being the protector, the provider, etc. And so you see these terrible things happening to the women in your family, and you can't do anything about it. So this affects your idea of your masculinity as well. And I think this is something that's going to come up when you read that introduction to Out of the Kumbla, that for Caribbean women feminists is they can't ever forget the male experience as well, which on the one hand has a lot of sexism and kind of traditional patriarchal stuff, but on the other hand they have had their masculinity sort of attacked and diminished as well. So that's part of the problem that is happening here. And also these women too who feel that they have no one on their side, that they are vulnerable in ways that men are not. And another wrinkle in this mess too is that a minority, I would say this is a very small minority of female slaves, they do recognize that they have this, I don't know, difference, and that they might be able to play it. Either to get favors, to get better treatment, maybe to get food, or just, better clothing or shelter or something. And they also might play this system with the male white owners to get special treatment for their children. There's no CVS, there's no birth control anyway. They're going to have children. So if the father is white, is the owner, it is possible that he might free the child. The child might not be enslaved, whereas a child that they had with a slave would automatically be a slave. So it's just a big old complicated mess with gender. And again, I do not look at this small group of female slaves who might be playing the system. I certainly do not look at them as in a negative way. I mean, they're trying to survive. They have been dealt just a terrible hand of cards here, and they're trying to survive. But they have access to something that the men don't. And so again, this is another way in which the male and female experience is just very divided. And it's really at the root of this gender divide. And so that is, I don't know, that's the big sort of Caribbean insight here. And so you can see too, I'm sure y'all talked about these kinds of stereotypes of female behavior, and you can think of them yourself. All of this history kind of really accentuates these sort of patriarchal stereotypes of women, female sexuality, etc. And Caribbean women who aren't white, they get stereotyped as being loose, immoral, oversexed, etc. And this is all because they are being raped and sexually exploited, which is not their fault. But as we know, historically, women are seen as they're seen as responsible for their sexual exploitation. So all of that fraught stuff will come back as we are reading. So where we will dovetail back to talking about narrative style and structure is, where does all this stuff with gender, does it lead into the ways in which these female narratives are told? When you read Out of the Kumbla, they're going to be arguing for women's literature, narrative literature, being very kind of autobiographical in form, that it might not be autobiography, but it could be sort of fictional autobiography, and that's a more sort of intuitive and natural female form. I think that, again, y'all talked about this in Dr. Stewart's class, so I'll be interested to hear how you're going to make connections. The last thing I want to bring up with gender, here we go. Yeah, the last thing I want to bring up with gender, actually, I messed this stuff up. So the next to last is this stuff with theorizing the third world woman. And here we are at the end of this PowerPoint. Another difference here with this Caribbean women is that when we're looking at this from a feminist approach, is that we need to keep in mind that a lot of times, especially, and I have done this myself, I do not consider myself above this or outside of this, third world women tend to get sort of stereotyped in this homogenous way as being victims, as being backwards, as being whatever kind of negative other thing you want to project on them. And two scholars in particular, Gayatri Spivak, who's a really, really famous, influential post-colonial scholar, and Chandra Tolpade Mohante, whose essay you're going to be reading this week, they have written a lot, they've done a lot of writing to kind of make sure that when we, and they include themselves in this, they are both from India, but they say, you know, we are not the typical third world woman. We have had access to education. We live in the West. We're, you know, when you read Mohanty, you will see she's like super up there in the upper echelons of literary discourse, etc. We're these intellectuals. We have tons of privilege that most women in India do not. Most women in India are very poor and don't have access to education. So they say, you know, we're approaching this from a point of privilege. And I certainly am approaching all of this from a condition of privilege. I'm white in the United States. I'm middle class. I've never had really hardships in my life to speak of. And so, and also, too, some of the things that I assume are important to me as a woman, you know, I want to be careful I don't project those onto women from different cultures, onto women from different races, onto women from different socioeconomic backgrounds, religions, etc., because they have their own beliefs and so forth. And also, you know, they're not just this homogenous lump of victims. Oftentimes, you know, they're very different. They're heterogeneous, as Spivak would point out, and they don't need necessarily me telling them what to do or telling them the best way to do things according to my point of view, etc. So we all need to be careful not to do this. And I have fallen in this trap. Before I taught here, I taught in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and I was at a community college where there were tons and tons of refugees from sub-Saharan Africa, and lots of them were very traditional Muslim young women and women. And, you know, I'd never met a Muslim person before. I'd just seen things on TV, and I had, you know, this horrible stereotype of Muslim women being these just backward, exploited, downtrodden women. And I was so wrong. And you know, it's embarrassing for me to look back on it, but, you know, I actually got to know people and realized that these situations are much more complex, and it's better to let people, you know, not to make these assumptions based upon stereotypes that I have, but to get to know people and to see that, certainly in the case of my students, they were very well able to advocate for themselves, and they were doing just fine, and they really didn't need me to come in and quote-unquote save them. So we'll want to be aware of these tendencies to go in and save people that we see as, I don't know, less than us for whatever reason. Maybe because they don't have birth control or something like that. Well, that's a priority perhaps for me or for Western feminists, but may not really be up on the list of priorities for women in other cultures. So we have to keep in mind that as a group, as women, we're all very, very different, and that just because we share this phenomenon of having a uterus or whatever, we're very different in terms of race, culture, socioeconomic class, etc., and we need to be very aware that our point of view is not going to be the point of view of the women in the books. So that's just sort of the warning that these two scholars give us. Let's see, and you know, if we do this kind of stereotyping, it's very dehumanizing. And we need to keep in mind too, and this is Spivak's big thing, she wrote Who Can the Subaltern Speak, talking about people who are the very, you know, the very most marginalized, oppressed, silenced group of people in any culture. And she says, you know, we really need to pay attention to who is speaking. Is the person speaking, are they speaking for this group? Are they a member of this group? If you're speaking, this means you've somehow been able to get an audience, so how did you get the power and agency to speak for yourself? And I guess it's kind of this reminder, here we might be, oh, I'm not coming to the end, that telling stories is very powerful. And we're going to come up on this question in the reading that we're doing this week, that when we get to this ability to tell our stories, when we have been silenced, well, what kind of stories come out? And what has this silencing been like, etc. So, let's see, I'm getting tired here. It's hot in my office because I have a window unit. Turn it off. Last thing here is also to remember when we're looking at these female theories is that there have been male theorists of Caribbean literature before 1990, and they were very kind of dominant. These male voices were very dominant before we see the female critics emerge in the 90s. So the male theorists were more sort of, I suppose, political. Like Fanon, they were very vocal about being anti-colonial, achieving independence in the 20th century if they were able to, very nationalistic, embracing national culture, embracing oral culture, and so forth. Those things become important to feminist Caribbean people as well. And also this phenomenon of negritude, which is a French Caribbean word, and it comes from negre, N-E-G-R-E, a French word, which is not exactly the same thing as the N-word in English, but it's not a nice word. And I've had French people, Caucasian French people, try to tell me, oh, it's just a jokey word, but they're full of it. Negre is not a nice word. It's not a nice thing to call somebody, and it comes out of euphemisms for people of African descent, slavery, etc. And so what the negritude movement was in the 1930s and 40s was this idea of reclaiming this African identity, sort of like the, I don't know, back to Africa, black power, black is beautiful. That was very big in the United States in the 1970s. They were influenced, negritude was influenced by the Harlem Renaissance, and it was just kind of, well, we've been told this identity is terrible, let's reclaim it, and let's embrace it and celebrate it. So these are the main sorts of approaches that the male theorists have been taking, and as we read these these theories of women's Caribbean literature, this stuff's going to come up. So I just wanted to make sure to get it out here on the page so that you would see these words and that you would have kind of an introduction to it before it got kind of dumped on you each week. Yikes, this is so long. I do apologize. But take a moment here at the end. You can go back. I could post this PowerPoint. I don't see why I couldn't. And again, jot down some questions. I'm going to have a discussion board here so that you can ask questions about this introductory lecture. It's real important that we talk about stuff here at the beginning and we get it straight, because we have no time. We've got 5 weeks. The race is on. You have run a marathon, and the sad news is you now have to run another one.